Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild supplement, The Hag's Hexes, designed by Tim Bannock with Matt Butler, JVC Parry, and Janek Sielicki. Apologies profusely if I've mispronounced any of those names. Designed for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shout out to my platinum patrons, Andrew, Brian, Richard, and Joe, and gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy Numa, Marcos David Vicente Gilberto, Sean aka Cert2B, Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, and Auxi. Thank you all very much for your support. Let's talk about hags, witches, if you will. A pretty prevalent part, obviously, of our culture in literature and really increasingly in horror, as seen in a lot of witches and supernatural baddies. D&D is obviously no stranger to hags. The Monster Manual has an entire, not a chapter, but a section on hags, as well as 3 different hag variants or versions, types. And then they came out with Volo's Guide to Monsters, which had an additional detailed, in-depth section devoted to hags, hag covens, new types of hags, all these different layer actions they would have. Reading this actually made me go back and look at Volo, because I was like, I'm pretty sure we got a lot of information on hags already, and sure enough, we did. So, right off the bat, and what's weird is I'm going to start with my biggest criticism. Even though I did generally like this supplement, is that I just wasn't sure, at least for me, I didn't really need more information on hags. I thought there was plenty already. Again, given the Monster Manual and Volo's Guide to Monsters particularly has a lot of information on hags. I would say like the book has already been written on hags for the most part in D&D. Now, obviously there is always room for more content. You could always squeeze more content in there, but if I were looking to design a supplement, something that has already been expanded upon further in one of the other official supplements, such as Volo's, is probably not one that I would look for. For example, like the UNT and the, I think like Kobolds have one, Orcs, like that kind of thing. They've just been done a lot, which isn't to say there is some other wiggle room. And in fact, you can tell by the cover art here, which is fantastic. One of the best things in this book is they look at the more, maybe not straight horrifying hag, but still the classic, like child luring, dangerous hag in the woods with the gingerbread house. The Hansel and Gretel story, obviously, is literally detailed here, and it's really great. This supplement is 60 pages long, has a very obvious theme. It's all about hags. It includes over a dozen new hag and hag-related creatures, so either they're minions or things that they would have with them. A bunch of magic items, I believe 2 dozen. There's a whole chapter on curses and bargains, which is a big part of what hags offer, kind of a deal with the devil type situation. There's also a lot of encounters, as well as 3 kind of mini one-shot adventures, and a whole chapter on basically just role-playing and tips on just kind of fleshing out the hags themselves. Now, some of these elements work better than others. I thought, for example, the one-shot adventures, the longer ones at the end, are probably the best part of the supplement. They're fairly well done. They're pretty linear, but they do a good job of really showcasing all of the new elements of the supplement, which is something I really appreciate seeing. The bestiary is okay for the most part. It's always hard for me to comment on because that's usually a balance issue, and that's not something I can really glean very well just from reading through it without actually going through and play testing. Magic items were okay. Curses and bargains is really difficult, and part of the challenge with running this enemy in a tabletop role-playing game is the fact that this is not a, they're not like a warlord, an orc chief or something. Their plans are usually much more personal and insidious in nature, which can be compelling, but also you have to really weave it. Hags are as compelling as the story will let them be, so they're not. I think they can be good villains, but they also can be very, very tricky to include. And it does mention in the supplement here that be careful about bestowing like some of these curses and bargains on your players, and make sure they're fully aware of all the things that are happening, because you don't want to be too overly cruel or just do like a gotcha trick as a DM. There are ways to run to run hags very well. I do think there is some notes on that. That's probably what this thing should have focused on in that section. But let's go through the hags, hexes, kind of chapter by chapter, and you can see what it's all about. In general, I did appreciate this supplement, even if I see its very reason for existing maybe not as quite compelling as other supplements with themes that I have looked at. The hags, hexes, is organized into 5 chapters, with chapter 1 as the bestiary, which is, I believe, the biggest chapter here. You can see there are over a dozen, get my mouse on there, over a dozen enemy types. Only a couple of them are actually hags. I think only like half of them are actually new hags. And even then, most of the new hags are just kind of regional or elemental themed. So like an ice hag is snow themed, a noon hag is summer or fire themed, the Shiatan is a desert hag. I mean, those are all, you know, useful in some ways, but not terribly interesting. They basically just took the sea hag and just kind of rethemed it, which that's fine. The coolest one, on my opinion, is the candy hag, which is the first one here. This is the Hansel and Gretel hag. You can see it's got a lot of details and notes. Her oven of souls, her candied minions. These are all absolutely fantastic. The fact that she also has all these minions that are very thematic. So she's got a gumdrop ooze that has different flavors. There's a rock candy monster. Looks kind of like a golem made out of candy, which is great. Like having all these like that's a really fun way to do a kind of a mini dungeon, is literally just do that Hansel and Gretel thing, have the players have to track down, and there's a good adventure that kind of puts this together. She's got gingerbread, little gingerbread figures with, you know, armed with blades, that kind of thing. There's a lot of really fun themed enemies, and it seems like a neat enemy type. And this was not necessarily like, you know, it's not, this supplement isn't worth it alone for that, but I feel like this was kind of the highlight of the bestiary for sure, was the candy hag and all her fun little minions. It's a good way of translating what would be kind of, it is a goofy fairy tale, I mean, for, you know, to adults to look back on, and then be able to like translate that into a D&D world where players like immediately know kind of what's going on. And I mentioned this when I've reviewed a lot of fairy tale stuff, because that's, you know, it's very inspirational to create a role-playing story out of these fairy tales, because we all know them. And I think it's a fun way to translate that into, because the players immediately know, okay, I know what's going on here. And then there's this woman who's like baking cookies, and she's going to offer it to the players, and like, oh, these are made out of kids, aren't they? And you know, just create like a little dungeon scenario out of that. So I think that's a really neat idea. This Candy Cottage Express is something I'm not familiar with. I don't know if this is a reference to something, but the fact that which I do like the fact that different hags have the ability of their actual layers can like move up and walk around and have their own stat blocks. Kind of like Baba Yaga with the chicken hut, you know, thing. With the Candy Hag, apparently her cottage can turn into a train or something. It picks up and moves literally like a what does it say? The hag will bake large gingerbread runners into the sides of the cottage, performing an ancient fey ritual to awaken the cottage. The house will pull the runners under itself and use the oven of souls as a steam engine. So she transforms it into a cottage candy train, which now I'm picturing some kind of really dark and fucked up version of the Polar Express, where she's just going through and luring kids into this train car with cookie shurikens and a steam funnel. I have no idea where that's from, how they came up with the fact that she can do that, but I love it. It's fantastic. It's got actual stat blocks: armor class, hit points, speed, everything. That's great. Otherwise, it's a couple different hags and kind of hag. As you see, the Kroll, it's the rock candy monster, that were okay. They weren't terribly revelatory. Changeling and Hagling were kind of like hag children, which are really creepy. Changeling is like, you know, the hags have the classic like snatch the baby away and do what kind of creepy rituals, or they replace the baby with something else, and that's kind of what the Changeling is. I believe the Hagling is literally like the offspring of a hag, and it gets into that kind of lore, and basically just all the lore that was already kind of there in our culture, or even in like Volo's a Monster Manual, are given like more details essentially, and stat blocks. The Feathered Hag is probably the other interesting one, which really just comes off as a really powerful version of a harpy. I don't even think she has any spells. She's just really strong and can fly, and otherwise, yeah, just a hideous bird-like creature. Horrifying visage. Doesn't seem I mean, what's weird is none of the hags are particularly powerful in terms of their stats, although they do have things. Although our hag nest is insane. Um, it's all about the role playing to make the creatures interesting. They're about manipulation. They're about taking advantage of like human nature and prey on the weaknesses of people like in a village. And the supplement does mention all of that, so it's hard to glean a lot of their general power and their villainous and their fear just based on these stat blocks. So I am very cognizant of that. You can see there's the Gingerbread Thief. Again, all the candy stuff is fantastic. I really love it to death. Everything, there's the gumdrop ooze, all of that worked out really well for me. I thought that was a delight. The rest of it was kind of okay. It was just what I was expecting. The elemental hags are kind of a shrug at best. Chapter 2, Bargains and Curses is a good part of what hags are all about. This kind of goes into what I was saying about they're all about the role-playing nature of using hags, which make them both interesting and difficult. And it does, to the supplement's credit, it mentions the fact that there aren't a lot of mechanics for how Bargains and Curses intersect with specific hags' magical abilities, nor their expected challenge ratings. This is intentional, because it's a lot of role-playing. It's a lot of social encounters, and I like that the designer kind of makes a nod to that. They didn't try to create a lot of rules systems in place for these things. In fact, they just kind of mentioned, like, here are ideas for setting together these packs or these bargains. There's the ones where they offer wishes. There's the great hunt, where the players essentially unwittingly enter into the most dangerous game and get hunted by I believe it's the feather hag in this one. Or is this forest hags or night hags could also employ in the bargain. The sweetest deal, where they attempt to find your true love, but in exchange you have to give them your firstborn daughter. All of these bargains are obviously very bad for you and good for the hag. And I like the fact that these aren't overly ruled. They're just kind of mentioned there. And all of them seem to be drawn from existing like pop culture references or things that make sense for these creatures to already engage in. I enjoyed the fact they weren't overly ruled, which is nice to see. Curses can be played out because they actually tie into the magic items a little later. A lot of these magic items will be powerful but also come with curses. Because again, that's kind of what hags are all about. Like, these things seem good, but they're gonna fuck you over in the end, or you're gonna find a magic item, they're gonna give you something, but it turns out to really not be that great. So this is another thing that's very hard to do in D&D, because I feel like player characters are, for the most part, very hardened, not to be jacked with. Like, they'll inside on everything, and I think there's an effective way to use hags and make them dangerous, but it's pretty tricky, and you really got to weave it into the story and probably use some NPCs and all that stuff, because I think players would be, for the most part, pretty wise to any kind of shenanigans that you're using with the hags. Items were okay for the most part. What I did really like about the items is they all included a nice story. They all had little tales here and there about where they came from and why they're magical. I'm trying to see if I can. Let's see. The axe used to belong to the mysterious Galfor, an ancient slayer of demons and monsters. The grandmother's Ursula scale. This entire paragraph is just not even about the scale. It's about the scale was ripped from grandmother Ursula's back by Willow Wrath during an altercation the two had some years ago. It's about this fight between two hags. And literally the entire paragraph is just about the fact that these two hags fought, and then it gets into like what that scale actually does in the next paragraph. So I appreciate that all of these have a little backstory to them. That really brings the flavor forward, which is nice to see. Chapter 4 is a little awkward. Notes about role-playing can be nice, but different DMs have different comfort levels and different ways that they run the table. Some are always going to be like, this person says this person says that. Others might be like, they just embody the character and they do the full voice. How many theater majors are D&D player, role-playing? It's the whole kind of thing. But not everybody is, so I can see why this is here, but it also reads a little strange to be like, hey, use a coy smile, squinting only one eye, a splayed finger. It's just like how to act like thing. I don't know. It seems very obvious to me, but I guess that could be part. It's only a very small part of the supplement, and I kind of cocked an eyebrow at that. Like, they have to give advice to like, hey, you should cackle your laughter or use a scary whispering voice and that kind of thing. That's like, well, yeah, just I don't know if that needed to be straight up bullet points in there, but and you don't have to do any of that. Like that's not necessary. I will say, chances are if you're using a hag, you are probably wanting to role play a little bit, because that's kind of what hags are. They're very creepy and social, and they're all too aware of how to prey on people and use their emotions and all of that thing. So if you're going to use a hag, then I imagine maybe that's part of why you want to, is because you want to relish the chance to do that. So in that case, on the other hand, you probably already know how to do all these things that it mentions. Otherwise, this chapter feels like a lot of what we already saw in Volos, which is just kind of a further explanation and expansion on how to use the hags, what kind of monsters you would see that might join a coven with the hags, specifically what kind of monsters you might find with certain hags, like Forest Hag, like an Ice Hag might use a giant ice toad, Night Hag could use a flame skull. That stuff's kind of useful. I guess if you're fleshing out a full dungeon with just the hag, that could be nice. The only way I would do that if I was using this Candy Hags, it's just too goddamn cool with the Krull and the Gingerbread Thief and the Gumdrop Ooze. I love that so much. The rest I'm not sure I would devote to a full layer on their own, but I mean, a Sea Hag, it seems pretty obvious what enemies you would put in there as well. I feel like I'm being very overly critical here, but I literally went back and read through like most of the hag section of Volos, and it just feels like this doesn't do much more. At least this one particular chapter doesn't really do much more than what Volos did. Granted, not everybody has Volos, so if you want to have more more hag information, you don't have Volos, and this could be more useful. But if you do, I think it's ultimately less useful to have. Chapter 5 is Encounters and Adventures, and the difference is encounters are, you can see, very brief, single paragraph drop-in, literally just one-off encounters, while adventures are actual like multi-stage, multi-encounter, but usually still one-shot adventures. The encounters kind of suck. There's not much you can do with an encounter, granted. They're kind of similar to, if you saw a random encounter in one of the official books and they just popped up a little less than a paragraph, probably a couple sentences about how these enemies might attack the party. That's kind of what these are. So I guess you shouldn't just expect a whole lot of them. They do take advantage of obviously using all the creatures, or most of the creatures, from the supplement itself. But for the most part, I don't think they are particularly interesting, other than I liked the Corrupted Villagers, maybe. You just enter a village that's got a bunch of people with a hag nearby. I guess that they're all, they kind of they're in cahoots with the hag, but they're basically in fear, and the hag's like stolen away all their children. It's these kind of things, like these very, very quick encounters that aren't terribly, terribly interesting, but the adventures are good. I like the 3 adventures at the end. They are an Affection for Confection, which is a great damn name, Menace of the Feathered Hag, and Wormling Napped. I don't like saying that one. The Affection for Confection is, of course, the Candy Hag, which I love to death, and this is a great example of how to use it. All these adventures do a good job of using all of the content from this supplement. So in this case, you find, you're in the woods, you find like a dead ranger with a bunch of gingerbread thieves coming after him. He's got like all this gold, and the players essentially track, and he's got this note about the fact that the children have gone missing, and the players track their way to this, of course, candy cottage in the woods, and they go through that whole thing. They have to fight some rock candy people. They meet the Candy Hag, who tries to make a bargain with them. You can see there's a little nice little grid map here. Not exactly a full-color battle map, which I like to have, but at least we did get a little bit of a grid map, which is nice. Sweet Cleo's cottage. I just love the Candy Hag. I love everything about it. I love all the enemies. The theme seems very cool. I like all that. You can see there's a lot of detailed notes about the descriptions and things here. Menace of the Feathered Hag kind of works like a messed up version of Alice in Wonderland with a players. There's how is it called? Shit, I forgot the name of it. It's one of the Craven Sprinter, which is like a rabbit, monstrously mutated humanoid rabbit creature. The players actually meet somebody who then ends up mutating into this creature. There's a neat little play on the fact that the Feywild is a lot slower than the material world, so you can be gone 3 days and you're gone for like hundreds of years in the real world. The players follow this like literal rabbit hole down into eventually the Feathered Hag domain, where they have to cross paths with a Feathered Hag, which is Willow Wrath, and she is quite powerful. In fact, I believe this adventure is a CR8 adventure. But again, with hags, it's very difficult, because are you just going to end up fighting them? Probably, or you could work with them and end up making a bargain and not being a fight. So who knows? Wormling Napped, I actually like this one quite a bit, because you actually end up working for a dragon who has lost her child, and I thought that was a really interesting, inciting incident that makes it very Dungeons and Dragonsy. Instead of the usual, just human child being kidnapped from a village, from a puritanical village and hauled off to the woods. It's a dragon, and it's an ice hag kidnapping the silver dragon's child and putting it into her lair so that her little hagling can feast on it and become an ice hag herself. Because, as we saw in the lore, apparently that's how haglings can turn into bigger hags. And there's a little dungeon here. But that's a really cool inciting incident. The players have to fight through a bunch of different monsters, and all of these adventures are really basically pretty short, pretty linear. They're very combat focused with a little bit of role playing at beginning and end. That's fine. That's like basically how you structure like an Adventurers League style adventure. Is you come up with like a dungeon, there's a good inciting incident, get everybody there, maybe you have like 1 or 2 people they can talk to, and then the rest is basically fighting. Boom, boom, boom. That works perfectly fine, in my opinion. I think they're all pretty interesting, and like I said, they all do a fine job of showing off the content in the supplement itself. Ultimately, I think it is well written, it's well organized. I assume this is just like the printer friendly version, because I'm not a fan of the actual white the white background with the kind of smallish text, but not enough to where I'm going to put that as a con or anything. I just don't. I just didn't really need all this extra hag stuff, I guess. So the actual purpose behind it wasn't a great need like there has been with other. So, like general fairy stuff has been really good, because there's not been a lot of like Feywild or information out there. But I feel like hags themselves, we've already got a lot of information, so I'm just a little more hesitant to give this one a full-on recommendation. Obviously, if you're looking for hags, first of all, don't go looking for hags. They're bad news. But if you're looking for information about hags and running in your campaign, then I think this one could be very, very helpful to you. But on the other hand, Volo's Guide to Monsters also can be very helpful, because it's got a huge section on hags with plenty of information in there. Let's go over my pros and cons for the Hags Hexes. Pros, the Hags Hexes includes over a dozen new monsters, 24 new magic items, and several encounters and adventures. Over 60 pages of content here, which is a lot of pretty damn quality content. Pros, there's an entire chapter devoted to the bargains and curses that hags employ. That's what really makes these monsters particularly interesting and unique compared to just about every other monster out there, besides probably devils, I guess. Yeah. Maybe like a genie or a sphinx. I'm trying to think, what else can kind of fuck with the players that way. But anyway, I like that there was a whole chapter devoted to, and I like that they're not overly rulesy. They're just very much like, almost like role-playing notes about here are the kind of bargains and that hags would want to make with players, and here's the kind of curses that could befall upon players if they use some of the hag's items, or if they just piss a hag off so much that the hag could employ this rather than just a straight-up fight, which most hags, looking at their stat block, don't really do well in a straight-up fight. Pro, the 3 one-shot adventures effectively showcase many of the new monsters and concepts featured in the supplement. So it does 2 things well. First, there are good adventures, I think, for what they are. I mean, they're pretty small and linear, but I think they're pretty solid. And second, they do a good job of showcasing each one of them features new elements from this supplement, which is awesome. In fact, something I didn't go over is a lot of the bestiary stuff has little adventure hooks that even has little tiny, like just a few sentences about how to include those monsters in an adventure, which I appreciate too. Pro, I just wrote down literally Candy Hag. I love it. I love the Candy Hag. I love that it was given a lot of other specific minions for the Candy Hag. It's just all of this makes me really want to just run a total one-shot like Hansel and Gretel style adventure where players go in and fight a bunch of gingerbread monsters, eventually kicking down the door and having like this kindly old woman trying to show them cookies and all these things. Like that's, and the end of it, of course, the whole thing is collapsing and players are trying to get out. Like that's, I can picture that as being a really fun, just one-off, goofy/fun adventure, and I think it works really well. That would, I might go as far to say that that alone is worth the price of admission for the Hags Hexes. Cons, as I kind of mentioned before, between the information already presented in both the Monster Manual and Volo's Guide to Monsters, we already had lots of lore and information on hags. I just think that I guess I appreciate the supply is here. I didn't have the demand as much for more hag information. Aside from the Candy Hag, which is great, the rest I just kind of nodded and my eyes kind of glazed over a little bit. So just a little bit of a less interest level. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I just had my fill of hags with what we already have, but if you're looking for even more, then I suppose it's there. Cons, the one-off encounter drops, none of them are particularly compelling or interesting, especially when compared to the adventures. Now, granted, I understand there's not much you can do there. There's just a couple lines and sentences and things, but still, didn't find them particularly interesting. Final verdict, in case Volo's Guide to Monsters wasn't enough, the Hags Hexes offers even more hag variants and lore, as well as cursed items, insidious bargains, and dark adventures. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.